Now let's take a look at the text tool. I'm going to go down here and select the text tool. When I select the text tool, I always like to look at what the settings are for that type. Photoshop will remember whatever the last settings were. So in this case, the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at headline type. A graphic designer is going to create a lot of headline type. There are certain things that we want to do with headline type, and that's different than when we're working with paragraph type, which we'll do in a minute. So here, I take a note that the type size is 12, and that's pretty good for paragraph type, but typically not good for headline type. So I'm going to start out with the headline type at about 72 points. I'm going to leave it Arial, and maybe I'll make it bold here for just a second. And then notice that I'm going to click, and when I click, it automatically adds this lorem ipsum text. Now it's highlighted, and I can type whatever I want. So headline. There it is. There's my headline. Once I'm done, I don't hit the return key. I go over here and I click on the layer, and now I've got the headline type on my canvas. I can grab the move tool and place it. But the thing I want you to note is that you are often going to be making adjustments to headline text. Specifically, you might be making adjustments to the spaces between the letters and maybe different size of type, etc. So to do that, you're going to double click on the T in the headline type, and you'll notice it highlights it all again. And then take a look up here. You can adjust the type style if you want. You can adjust the boldness. You can change the size. You can make it left, right, or center justification. You can change the color. This is to give it some warping effects. You can play with that. We're not going to talk about that right now. Where I really want to draw your attention is this little icon right here, which is the character and paragraph palette. When I click and open the character and paragraph palette, I'm going to just drag these down here so that we can see them better. Now you'll notice that I have access to a lot more of the features of typography than just this option bar up here. Taking a look at the character palette, you'll notice I have the same functionality where I have the type style and the bold. But over here, for example, is leading, which we'll talk about in a moment when we get to the paragraphs. But one other thing I want to point out to you is right here, this guy right here, if I hover over it, it's going to say set the kerning between two characters. And this guy right here, if I hover over it, it's going to say set the tracking for the selected characters. Those two things are related. It is dealing with the space between characters. The tracking is dealing with the space between all of the characters, in this case, all of the letters in the word headline. Kerning deals with the space between two letters. So say, for example, I wanted to change the space between the capital H and the E, that would be kerning. If I wanted to change the space between all of the letters in the word headline, that would be tracking. To show you what I mean, I'm going to go over to this tracking drop-down menu, and I'm going to add tracking, say 100, and boom, you'll notice that it spreads the letters out in all of the letters of the word headline, of our headline, which is different than kerning. I'm going to undo that for a second. And remember I said kerning deals with the space between two letters. So what I have to do first is put that insertion point, click between the two letters I want to work with, and then over here in this kerning drop-down menu, I can either make the space less or I can make the space more. Now you can type in there if you want, and watch this. You can even scroll. See how, I'm going to zoom in on that for you for a second. See how when I move over that, I get a pointer finger and two arrows? I can click and hold the mouse, and if I drag less, I drag it down. If I drag right, I drag it up. So you can do this by eye and just drag it to what it looks good for you. And sometimes you want to close it up or kern it in. Sometimes you want to open it up and kern it out. Now, why would you kern? Well, when you kern headline type especially, what you're trying to do is keep sort of an even volume of space between the letters so that it doesn't look awkward. You can think of it almost like music where there's just a nice smooth beat between each letter. If it's off, then it gets a little bit awkward. Now, sometimes you might want to intentionally make it off because that's part of your design. You want it to feel awkward. But in this case, we want all of the space between the letters to look pretty much the same. And so we might kern one of the letters or kern a couple of the letters in or out. Okay, so that's kerning. I'm going to close these palettes for a second, and I'm going to delete this headline type. And I'm going to grab the text tool again, and I'm going to dial down the text size to 12. And then this time, instead of a line of text, I want to create a paragraph of text. So I'm going to, instead of clicking down and up, I'm going to click and drag, and you'll notice that it adds a paragraph of type. Now this is very convenient because now I have this rectangle that I can resize as needed based upon what my design requirements are. And so maybe this looks good for me, but what's really nice with this rectangle that allows me to resize the paragraph shape is that if the client wants it to be a little bit thinner or a little bit fatter or wants to add more text and stuff like that, I'm not dealing with all of these carriage returns and trying to have to fix all of that. I just resize this as I need it, and there you go. Now the other thing I want to point out to you here is in the paragraph and character palette, specifically the character palette again, I want to draw your attention to this guy right here, this leading. See how it says auto? Auto tends to be the default, which is Photoshop deciding on how much space between the lines of text. That's what leading is. So auto tends to be about right in most circumstances, but for design purposes, sometimes you want that space to be more, sometimes you want it to be less. If you want it to be more, you want it to feel more airy and light. If you want it to be less, you want it to feel more compressed and dense. For example, let me just zoom out here again, and I'm going to change this from bold to regular, and then I'm going to add a different leading, say 18 point, and you'll notice now I'm going to deselect for a second and see how light and airy that type looks. And that's a feeling that you might want in your design, which is substantially different than if I select this text. I'm going to make it bold, and then the leading I'm going to make very tight. We call it tight. And then I'll deselect. Now look at that. That has a completely different feel and tone than the previous text we saw. The previous one was light and airy. This one is denser and it's more aggressive. And in fact, I can even do what we did in the previous video and take the tracking way down and make it even tighter. And now that looks completely different than the open, airy, light text. So just to review here, you have headline text, click, you get a single line of text. You want to pay attention to kerning, the space between two letters, and you want to pay attention to the tracking, the space between all of the letters. When we're dealing with a paragraph of type, you want to click and drag a rectangle, and then you are going to create whatever feel you want that type to have by adjusting its leading, making it open, or making it more dense, closing up the leading. So there you have it. That's type in Photoshop.